Remember this moment?
Jesus Christ!
You're marching along, minding your own business, feeling more familiar and comfortable with the Raccoon City police station than you did during your first few hours. And then, boom. Out of nowhere comes Mr. X, ripping the crashed helicopter from the wall and tossing it aside with such insurmountable strength that it immediately screams threat. All of it done without warning, without announcement, without a cutscene, and better yet, without any form of acute direction given to the player about what they need to do next. Do they fight this monster? Do they run? Is this a boss? What do I do? The appearance of Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 completely changed the way you see the game world. You spent 5 hours with this slow drip of tension, occasionally leaping into full-blown panic, that when he enters the chat, the tone of the game is flipped upside down. Because you have your slow, methodical strategizing to compare it to, and because he appears without a marching band heralding his introduction, the shock of the panic is what's scariest of all. The game makes you wait for it. Someone at Capcom saw the reception to Mr. X and said, "Damn, well now we've gotta remake Resident Evil 3, right? People will lose their minds when they see Nemesis, chuck him in the first few minutes. No, wait, better yet, chuck him in the first seconds." Resident Evil 3 Remake has a lot of issues. Being a shoddy recreation which cuts content from the original is one. Introducing ideas and themes which it never capitalizes on is another. But to be fair to the end product, it results in being a disappointing game with glimmers of greatness. Its opening, however, is just plain bad in so many ways, but mainly because it has a Nemesis problem. This is the first 10 minutes.
This pandemic has spread faster than any disease in modern history.
The opening hits all the right notes in its first 58 seconds. We're brought up to speed with the state of Raccoon City not through in-engine cutscenes, but live action reports. The city is on fire, the streets are ablaze, the undead are walking, and the rioting and looting aren't making matters much better. The fact that all of this is presented to us through live action makes it a jarring introduction, almost sickly in its uncanniness. It's always unsettling to see full motion video in a game, and it's a neat reference to Resident Evil's legacy, with the first game's opening relying heavily on live actors running through the woods to build tension. Intercutting it with the smiling corporate umbrella representative spouting platitudes and slogans which are so antithetical to what we're seeing in the newsreel keeps up that sense of unease. Oh, and fun fact, Dr. Matt Gorkas is using his real name here. He's played by actor Matt Gorkas. Commitment, honesty, integrity. 3 words we see much too often on pharmaceutical companies' websites in the real world, and because it's so fake, it clashes with the live-action realism, making it alien and eerie. And then at second 59, the game ruins it. We aren't even a full minute into the game. The horror hasn't even had a chance to sit down for dinner yet, never mind start snacking on us, and Resident Evil 3 has the gall to lead with dessert. It's so desperate for us to get pumped for Nemesis that it doesn't put in any of the build-up needed to make it effective later. We see the scientists waking it up, the tiny gloop of an eye shooting open, them loading it into the helicopter, and the game thinks it's building up dread for when we come face to face with it, but instead the player is just confused about why the game's monster under the bed is in full view, shitting on my sheets. But honestly, that isn't even the worst part. I'd be madder if the game didn't plaster old Nimoy here on the bloody box art and posters with Vogue level lighting. A disappointing end to minute 1. The introduction to Jill Valentine is much more effective. There's a lot of great work which goes into our first meeting and the presentation of her PTSD, which is just sorely wasted later when the game doesn't capitalize on this. But this video is all about the opening, so let's focus on that. The colours are bleary and washed out, similar to how the world looks when Jill's running on low health later on, and if Resident Evil 3 gave us the remotest hint that it actually cared about this characterization of Jill, I would argue that these greying colours were here to establish that when Jill is on low health, she's having a traumatic flashback or a panic attack, but honestly, I think it's just here to signal that she's dreaming. The use of a first-person perspective here is for two reasons. The first is so we can truly examine all of the little details in her apartment. We can see the bottles of pills, the numerous bottles of beer, the conspiracy corkboard she's erected on her wall in as much glorious detail as the RE engine can muster. The second is to align the player and Jill in this bleary-eyed, confused headspace you often feel when waking up. Resident Evil 3 effectively gets the player into the head of Jill Valentine at its start. This is mainly effective because the camera isn't as well adjusted as it is in, say, Resident Evil 7's first-person angle. It's slightly zoomed in, which you can't necessarily tell from this footage, but if you've played the opening, you know exactly what I mean. The tilting of her head feels just too sharp when you flick the analog sticks, and it detaches you from the action in a really sickly way. This is, as far as the detail goes, pretty fantastic. Into the bathroom, we see even more pills, and just because this is a dream doesn't make the impact less poignant. Our badass hero who beat the tyrant and blew up the Spencer mansion is struggling with her mental health. She's already in a weakened state by the time the game starts, so any further horrors she might experience might just break her. Blood drips from her nose, and in the dim light she watches herself change and evolve into a rotting, grey husk. A letter you can find in her apartment confirms this, but it's clear she's harbouring a deep-seated terror of the T-virus incubating inside of her, ready to go off and kill her any day now. She raises the gun to her head and tries to end it all before she turns. With the gunshot, it cuts to black, and she awakes with more colour bleeding into view. She comments that it gets worse every night, reinforcing that this has been a recurring nightmare for the past 3 months. The worst thing of all is that when we take control of awake Jill, the apartment has evolved slightly. The drinking problem was worse than we initially thought. There are bottles everywhere. Same goes for the pills. She hasn't been eating well at all. Dishes pile up in her sink. Just from the environmental details here, it's clear she's falling apart. Back into the bathroom, we finally get to see her in all her glory. Just like with the remake of Resident Evil 2, the game knows that we are excited to see our hero, so it ekes out the reveal with the first-person fake-out. Just like how with Leon and Claire, it led with the trucker and then the close-up, claustrophobic shots of individual body parts. She checks for signs of infection, and the camera zooms out to a third-person perspective. It's a quiet, contemplative, depressing opening, setting a tone similar to that of Resident Evil 2, that this is going to be a slow, methodical, insidious experience.
Alright, let me grab mine.
All of this goes out the window when Nemesis attacks. And it's here that the game replaces nuance, hints of dread, a suffocating atmosphere, with obnoxious, overwhelming yelling about how scary it is. Jump scares in game cutscenes never, ever work. It doesn't matter how much a game's cinematography tries to adapt that of films, the fact that a player goes from controlling and being responsible for the well-being of a character to watching them do their own thing without them means that it doesn't matter how big and scary Nemesis is. The fact he bursts through the wall during a moment of quiet doesn't jolt a player into action. So much of this introductory scene is showy, ostentatious in its display. Nemesis punches through the wall, then he steps into the light for the camera to get a good look at him, sporting a bin bag on his head to, what, conceal how horrible he looks? He's on the front box, for God's sake. And then he kicks Jill into a wall for fun, I guess. And then after all of this, he waits another few moments for Jill to catch her breath, look up at him, and then start firing some shots. I can almost imagine the director going, okay, good, now John, make sure you turn that camera up so we can get a good look at Nimoy's face. Wait, Jill, stop shooting! The fact that all of this takes place in a cutscene is indicative of what Resident Evil 3's greatest failure is with its horror. It announces the frights to you. Resident Evil 1 announced its first zombie in a brief cutscene and then hid it from view with the fixed camera angles, instilling a confused momentary panic from the player. Resident Evil 2 did the same, locking you in a thin corridor and forcing you to fight it with no room to run in order to tutorialize combat and set your teeth on edge. Later, when Mr. X appeared out of nowhere, your fight or flight response kicked right in. With Nemesis, you can sit back and have a cuppa or a smoke while Jill and Nemesis get into it. Looking good, Jill! This is the player's first interaction with Nemesis, 7 minutes in. We don't even know what a bloody zombie looks like yet. The game started at a 10, so it's got nowhere to go when it wants to return to its steady tense horror. Instead of the tension graph looking like this, it ends up looking more like this. And don't tell me, oh, the original game was more action horror, this is fine, because yes, it was, but not to this level of obnoxiousness. And also, Remake wants to be a classic survival horror at so many upcoming moments, but sections like with the bugs in the Transformer yard feel trite, because before you even get a gun in your hand, you're strung along on an on-rails chase sequence. And that's what this is. You control Jill for 10 seconds at a time before control is ripped away from you so we can get more shaky cam of Nimoy. If you dart into this apartment after escaping him, you can chill here for as long as you like. It seems like Nemesis's greatest weakness is a bloody bookshelf. The game should have opened with Jill dealing with a couple of zombies in her apartment building, fleshing this out as a small area for us to climb through before Nemesis appeared. It would have meant that we'd have more dangerous enemies than the zombies to already struggle with, maximising the impact of Nemesis being so much stronger than them when he appeared. It also meant that we would have an actual area to organically run around in and try to escape. Capcom littered this sequence with random yellow strands of police tape, like there's the possibility the player could get lost from this one direction they are forced to travel in. Sorry Capcom, but when you're funneling me down one path, not only is the scare factor severely diminished because I don't feel like I'm in control of Jill's destiny, but it also makes her use of colour theory much less impressive and organic than you think it is. By minute 8, we catch a glimpse of Raccoon City burning. People are throwing themselves from windows. The coming rain, which will dominate Resident Evil 2, hasn't arrived yet, so the city is awash with an impressive fiery glow that paints the city as ready to blow. Jill climbs through another heavily signalled window, and the control is, yet again, ripped away from us for a Nemesis reintroduction. Not only that, but it's in slow-mo. Slow-mo. And speaking of slow, the constant use of cutscenes just end up making Nimoy a confusing enemy to fight. Why does he keep waiting for Jill to catch her breath before he attacks her? If he's this slow and lumbering, he's not half the threat that Mr. X was from Resident Evil 2. He's actually characterised as dumber and more stupid than the previous game's tyrant because of all this. He's had easily 4 or 5 opportunities to quickly finish Jill off in these scenes, but instead he's wasting time, chilling behind bookcases or letting the camera get a good look at him. There is a really effective scare a few seconds after Jill escapes his tentacle, but of course, it's then gouged away by the return to an in-game cutscene. We see a ladder towards the end of this fire escape, and a little interact icon flashes up, just for us to kick it down and climb to safety, but just as the interaction appears, boom, Nemesis crashes through the wall on our left and grabs us. I really love this moment in a vacuum, but the fact he throws Jill away after having her meters from his face and with a quick squeeze of his hand would have popped her skull, again, just makes our big scary titan look like an ineffectual idiot, saying nothing of why he rips a part of the roof off and chases her with it when he's already proven himself to be strong enough to blast through walls. Why are you purposely slowing yourself down, you cretin? The shot over his shoulder is obviously supposed to frame Jill as small and Nimoy as larger than life, but again, when the camera messes around, it detaches what's happening in the action from the familiar game experience we've grown accustomed to, so the player doesn't feel as threatened by the scares as they should. It feels gimmicky, and when running from a monster feels gimmicky, it becomes artificial, like a roller coaster ride, rather than an immersive horror experience. Jill bursts out of the apartment building and has to steady herself in the alley wall, signalling that just this one interaction with Nemesis has already knocked her for 6. But the player doesn't feel like that, because they got to have 4 rest periods during the chase scene. Where Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2's frights were all for the player, Resident Evil 3's opening is just for Jill. And this is frustrating because in about half an hour, Nemesis lands and chases you without a big bombastic introduction. He just drops to the street and starts chasing you. Zombies be damned, and while I'm not the first to say this, it needs to be said. This stuff is the best moment of the game, and if Capcom was so desperate to open with Nemesis, they should have made it feel more like this, rather than this. Our 10 minutes come to an end with Jill reuniting with STARS pilot Brad Vickers, who explains why Nemesis is chasing us. For some reason, it's after the only 2 STARS members left in town. The mystery of Nemesis, of why he's focused solely on killing us, dissipates because of this opening scene with Umbrella getting him ready and Brad's expository dialogue. Ultimately, this is where the game leaves you, with a single hope that the game gets better from here. And apart from a couple of shiny gems like Nemesis chasing us in the street or working through the hospital, it doesn't. All because of the tone 3 sets in this opening. Thanks for watching. This is video 3 of 7, breaking down the effectiveness of the mainline Resident Evil openings, building up to a full-blown critique of Resident Evil Village next month. If you liked what you saw, like and subscribe, and as always, take care.